Thank you, and I appreciate you having everything set so that we can call this meeting to order at exactly 6:00 p.m. on February 5th, 2025, Planning Commission meeting for the City of Lake Stevens. Let's have a call to order. Do we have a flag for the Pledge of Allegiance?
We do. There we go.
If you would all join me in standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you for doing that. That was not on our agenda tonight, so I was hoping that that would continue to be part of our protocol and that we would not be singing the national anthem, which was my fallback plan. So thank you. Let's go through a roll call. Let's do this. I'm looking right to left. So Commissioner Jennifer Davis.
Present.
Commissioner Marika Martz.
Present.
Commissioner Dewar.
Here.
Commissioner Connor Davis.
Here.
Commissioner Bruce Morton.
Here.
And Commissioner Nathan Packard.
Present.
Thank you so much for all being willing to be a part of this commission and for also being flexible in how we do this. Tonight is an interesting night outside, and I think that this was the right choice, so I appreciate that so much. We have a public hearing coming up, and I want to make sure that we are honoring any guests that might have joined us either in person. I will say right now that Russ Wright, Director Wright, is seated at City Hall. Thank you for being there and representing the city. As this is a public hearing, Director Wright is at City Hall in Conference Room A for any member of the public who wishes to comment this evening on any of the issues that we're going to be discussing. So, Director Wright, I see that you are lonely and alone.
That's correct. No public at this point.
Okay. We will, as we open up the public hearing, ask again. However, we want to make that aware. Again, public hearing is something that is substantial, and we want to give everybody the ample opportunity to comment. So thank you for being there. Okay, moving on. Can we please do the approval of minutes that were included in our packet? Did all of the commissioners have a moment to review the minutes from our last meeting?
Yes.
Were there any edits or changes?
No.
Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as written?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those approve?
Aye. Aye.
Any oppose? Any abstain? Okay, minutes are approved as written. Thank you so much. There were some twists and turns in that meeting as well. So at this point, we are going to open a public hearing. This is the public hearing to review some changes to our comp plan that we had sent on to City Council back in November. And I will ask that we have a motion to open the public hearing, please.
I'll make that motion to open the public hearing.
Do I have a second on that?
I'll second.
Thank you so much. With the motion approved, or all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. With the motion approved and seconded, we will turn the time over to Senior Planner Leviton for the updates on these changes to the comp plan.
All right, thank you, Chair Huxford. Commissioners. So this is going to be, as you mentioned, a public hearing. So this is our 2024 comprehensive plan update. As noted, it was adopted by the City Council back on October 22nd, following a recommendation from the Planning Commission on October 9th. As required for legislative amendments, especially for periodic updates, we had sent this off to the Department of Commerce for review. It took them a couple of months to get us back their comments and to clarify what they were looking for. But basically, when it comes down to it, they had requested that we make a couple of just minor technical edits, do a little bit of extra analysis, which I'll get into on the next slide, um, to make sure that it's compliant with all of the changes to the Growth Management Act that occurred back in 2021 through House Bill 1220. So for tonight, just going to give a very, very brief staff presentation. There's going to be an opportunity for public comment. It doesn't look like we have anyone virtually or there at City Hall, but that is a requirement for the public hearing. Commission is welcome to discuss, deliberate, and ask any questions about the proposed changes that are shown in attachments 1 and 2 of this agenda item. And then we are asking that the commission make a formal recommendation. This having the public hearing, it was pretty minor as far as the amendment, but in consulting with the city attorney, wanted to make sure that we went through all of the proper channels and reopen the public hearing, and have this recommendation forwarded on to the city council. So just a reminder, comprehensive plan process took about 18 months from beginning to end. A draft of the plan was issued last July. Accepted public comments on that, accepted commission and council comments, incorporated those comments into a public review draft. Sorry, the public hearing draft, which was issued at the end of September. The Planning Commission opened their public hearing on October 2nd, continued that meeting to October 9th to allow for additional public feedback, made their recommendation to approve the plan, and the City Council ultimately held their own public hearing and adopted both the comprehensive plan, including the future land use map, the comprehensive plan land use map, as well. That was Ordinance 1188, and then an Ordinance 1189, which was the associated rezones, basically the map amendments to the zoning map to correspond with the changes to the land use map. So as noted, we had submitted this to Commerce in late October. It took basically right until the end of the year to get the exact language and the analysis that they wanted to make sure that we incorporated in to be fully compliant with the Growth Management Act, or GMA. The main item was to provide a quantitative analysis of emergency housing needs within the city's land capacity analysis, which is attachment 2 in your packet tonight. When we had prepared the land capacity analysis, or LCA, we had been using 2023 guidance from the Department of Commerce that said that if we allowed emergency housing in all zones where hotels were permitted, that we didn't need to do the quantitative analysis. I guess in June 2024, they started letting cities know that they had kind of misinterpreted that section of the Growth Management Act and were wanting all cities to do it. We didn't find out about that until after the fact. So now, just to comply, we made sure that we went back in, updated the land capacity analysis, looked at our different residential and commercial zones to make sure that we had adequate zone capacity to accommodate our allocated emergency housing needs, which is 304 emergency housing beds over the next 20 years, basically. So along with the updates to the LCA, had to just make some minor amendments to the housing element. Chapter 3 of the plan, which is attachment 1 in your packet tonight, just to also have a little beef up the discussion a little bit of what's called adequate provisions, basically that we can meet our housing needs at all different income levels and at all different housing types. So we've incorporated that into attachments 1 and 2. Those are shown as track changes. We sent those back out to the Department of Commerce a couple of weeks ago, and they were good in reviewing those promptly and letting us know that with the proposed changes shown in attachments 1 and 2, we are now fully compliant with the Growth Management Act. And so basically brought it back for this public hearing before the Planning Commission so that they can make a recommendation. Just wanted to stress we're not reopening the entire comp plan. This public hearing is just for the proposed edits shown in attachments 1 and 2. There are no proposed amendments to Ordinance 1189, which was the concurrent rezones to the comp plan. And so, yeah, we are now here for the Planning Commission to deliberate, to accept any, receive any public comments on the plan, and then ultimately to make a recommendation. So a notice of public hearing was issued back on January 24th. We have not received any written public comments as of today. We issued a SEPA addendum, basically noting that the proposed changes wouldn't result in any potentially environmental impacts that hadn't already been analyzed in the original SEPA determination of non-significance that was issued with the plan back in July. And the public now has that opportunity to provide oral testimony. So if we do have anybody show up, asking the Planning Commission to accept that oral testimony, discuss and deliberate, ask any questions, and then to make a recommendation to City Council to modify Ordinance 1188 to reflect the changes shown in attachments 1 and 2. And then the City Council is scheduled to hold their public hearing on February 25th. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions.
The first question, of course, is do we have any public, either online or in person?
No public in person.
No one online currently.
Then I open it up to the commissioners to ask any questions that they might have.
Okay, I have a question.
Suggest you close the public comment portion.
Can I defer closing?
You can.
Let's
Just in
defer
case someone
closing.
shows up. Yeah. Okay, well, I have a question. So on page 48 of the packet, this is the new Appendix B, or I guess it's the updated Appendix B. So David, could you explain what this option B is for the city's analysis of this of fulfilling this this requirement? I guess I'm looking at the 5th bullet point from the bottom. It says for emergency housing analysis, the city has opted to utilize option B from the September 2024 Commerce Guidance. I just wanted to get an explanation of that.
Yeah, so there were just basically a couple different methodologies that the city could utilize. Basically, they understand that it's hard to get to exact numbers and to provide really a super sound quantitative analysis when you're dealing with basically zone capacity. You have to make a number of assumptions. And so the option B was kind of the most simple one. I can pull that up. But it basically was just explaining that there were a couple different methods that Commerce allows you to do when doing this land capacity analysis. So this was, it's basically the assumed density method is that they had prepared kind of some basically examples of different emergency housing development types with assumed densities. So if you say had an acre site and it was going to be like a 3 or 4 story, more shelter type of use, that would obviously have more beds per acre than say like a low rise, kind of more suburban, emergency housing, site. And so it basically allowed you to utilize kind of essentially the template that they had developed for different ones. And so if you look down at the next page, Sorry, it's not on the next page. It is on. So table 4, which is on page 52 of the packet, we basically used a couple of the different examples that Commerce had developed with their assumption of, kind of a density of beds per acre, and basically had to come up to get to a number. The number was 304. And so we basically noted how many acres we would need at those assumed densities to hit those 304 emergency housing beds. And, if you look back up so that's in table 4. And when you look at the estimated residential capacity within our commercial and mixed use zones within table 1, it shows about 74 net acres. So we would need to have about 5 of those net acres that would be available for emergency housing. And so basically we could confidently say that we had adequate zone capacity within our commercial and mixed use zones to utilize a small portion of that for zone capacity for emergency housing needs.
So the big picture here is that in the city, we currently don't have any permanent supportive housing, which is basically emergency shelters, and hotels are considered part of that. Is that true?
Well, so there's a difference. So permanent supportive housing is more kind of permanent low income housing typically with wraparound services for people that need both housing as well as public services. So that's an analysis that we had to do. We had done the quantitative analysis of permanent supportive housing. Emergency housing is more temporary. It's for emergent situations, and so need to show basically, based on the revised guidance, was that our Appendix B, our land capacity analysis, we hadn't said, hey, we have this many acres at this assumed density to meet emergency housing needs, which, we're projected to need about 304 emergency housing beds. So that's what this analysis did. It basically utilized that one of those options that the Department of Commerce had developed. And then we basically looked at our zone capacity within those zones, would need to utilize essentially about 1/15 of that zone capacity. So about 6.5% of that, and can confidently say, we still need to demonstrate that we can meet our other housing needs as well as our employment needs. And so when we looked at it holistically, we could confidently say that we can meet the emergency housing needs, the permanent supportive housing needs, all of our other housing needs at all different income levels and housing types, plus also meet our employment growth target through the year 2044. So basically had to kind of redo the LCA to look at all of these different things that the Growth Management Act, as amended by House Bill 1220, requires us to do.
So basically, if a private organization wanted to build such facilities in the city, there is zoning capacity for that to exist. We would have to basically prove to the state that we aren't kind of pushing that type of facility out of possibility because of our too restrictive zoning. Is that what that means?
Yeah, so I mean the zoning, obviously we did the rezones through Ordinance 1189 to go along with the land use map amendments and to show that we have adequate zone capacity. The next step is to, as all other jurisdictions, at least within Central Puget Sound in 2025, we need to go back in, and one of the code amendments that's on your long range work program is housing implementation, and a lot of that is related to what's called step housing. So kind of transitional housing, emergency housing, permanent supportive housing, basically need to update our code to show that our code is compliant with state law and with the Growth Management Act. So the comp plan established the policy framework. It analyzed whether or not we had the zone capacity. Now in 2025, we need to actually implement the plan. We need to go in and amend our development code to allow for emergency housing in all of these different zones. So we'll need to update Chapter 1440, the permissible use chapter, and then need to go back into our development standards and to other sections of the code to make sure that we permit these uses that we had analyzed as part of the comp plan analysis, and that we don't put anything in place that would basically make it impossible to develop them. You know, the city's not allowed to say, hey, they're permitted, but you have to do this and this and this. There's specific language within the Growth Management Act as far as regulations that the city can establish for things like public health and safety. Cities are allowed to do that as part of their development code updates, but can't just outright prohibit them.
And that's what table 5 is for, where you've got statements in here, like in that third column, mentioning several times where you know, these are things that need to be addressed in 2025 regulations. Right?
Correct. And so table 5 and table 6 were these kind of the basically Commerce, you know, knew that we needed to update the LCA. I think we were kind of already largely compliant with the adequate provisions, but they asked us to specifically, and there's nothing within the statutes that say that you have to utilize these tables, but their preference is to include them just to try to standardize it and make it easier to note any barriers that exist and any adequate provisions that need to be made. So we figured that as long as we were updating Appendix B, we might as well go in and provide just a little bit more clear-cut language on any barriers that exist and how the city is going to remedy those potential barriers as part of our code work in 2025.
And that'll be part of the things that we'll be having in meeting. We'll be discussing these things in meetings for the rest of the year, right?
Yeah, we're gonna need to have several meetings on this. It's a pretty complicated topic. I would expect there will be some community interest. And so, yeah, we're working on developing that scope, getting that scheduled, fitting that in with all of the other items that we discussed as part of your long range work program. But, and, you know, the commission had expressed, you know, very much, you know, I think 4 out of the 7 commissioners had noted that housing implementation was a very high priority for them. So we're going to make sure that we have, you know, a good public engagement strategy on those, and that we have lots of check-ins with both the Planning Commission and the City Council, just to make sure that there is, you know, adequate time spent, because this is a pretty meaty issue.
Yeah. Well, thanks for explaining all those things. That's all the questions I have.
Are there any other questions by the commission?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. One of the things that was mentioned is that some of these things are things that we're being asked to do. And I just, for the sake of clarity, David, is it that we're being asked to change these things, or is it that we're being required to change these things? And one of the reasons, for example, when we looked at, you know, table 4 that was included at looks like the request of Department of Commerce, you know, I look at the cities that they have in there, and those cities aren't what I would consider to be at all comparable to City of Lake Stevens. You know, Spokane, I mean, that's easily 200,000 residents in that example. And Shoreline, you know, that's substantially bigger, and I would assume larger assessed valuation than City of Lake Stevens has. So is this kind of a one-size-fits-all thing that we're being required to do, or are these aspirational asks that they have given us?
Yeah, so sorry for kind of misspeaking. So they required us to update the analysis to include the land capacity analysis, to include the quantitative analysis. As far as the table 4, so table 4, you know, utilizing that option, kind of the basically the density assumption option that they had done. So yeah, there were a lot of them, and there were a lot of ones that were in Seattle. I deliberately didn't pick the ones with the one in Spokane probably has the highest density, obviously, you know, because that was the opportunity for, I think that was like a 3-story emergency housing shelter, which with it, you know, that obviously is probably, you know, in Spokane is a different, you know, is a much larger city, but within our sub areas where you can go up to 45 feet or 55 feet, that's still technically, there is zone capacity for that, because the development standards that are currently in place within our sub areas, which has most of our commercial and mixed use land, it would technically allow for something that size and scale. Whether there's the market for that in Lake Stevens is something different, but we're not required to evaluate the feasibility of this getting built. We're required to show that if somebody wanted to build it, that there is the development capacity, the zone capacity for that. As we get into the actual code work, as I noted, there are some opportunities for us to establish local regulations to assess any community concerns or planning commission or city council concerns within the parameters of the Growth Management Act and what it lists that cities can and can't do at the local code side of things. But like the one in Olympia, the one in Shoreline is an example of one that's on the lower end as far as density. When you think about, that this is basically just emergency housing, it's not like a lot of larger individual units intended to provide permanent supportive housing where your density is going to be lower because you have more living space per resident or per tenant. This is intended to just show that there are a couple development models that can be utilized within our sub areas, primarily within our commercial and mixed use areas. So we're not beholden to developing these specifically. And I think the fact that we would only need, potentially 5 acres based on this mix of densities, and we have much more than that available, even if we were to say, have all of our emergency housing needs, be met through just that top line, the North King County in-house shelter, which is a much lower density at 23 beds per acre. We could still easily meet that. It would be more like 12 acres as opposed to 5 acres, but we do have adequate zone capacity for that.
Okay, so it sounds like all the changes that we have in front of us here are indeed required and not.
Yeah, so they're
simple
required,
action.
and so the adequate, the tables 5 and 6, including the tables per se, is not required, but they did say that to be fully compliant with the Growth Management Act, that we did need to add a little bit of additional analysis related to making sure that we had adequate provisions to allow for housing affordable at all different income levels to be built in Lake Stevens. And we thought that the easiest way to do that was just to use the tables that they've recommended. They don't require those tables, but they require the analysis. We chose, kind of the method and the structure for how we illustrate the data.
Got it. Thank you.
I had a quick question about the barrier checklist. Just to restate it for myself, our task from Commerce was, my understanding is to perform the analysis piece, which seems fairly straightforward, and then to do the barrier checklist. But we're in compliance now, according to Commerce, because you did the work of identifying potential barriers to us meeting our goal, our mandated goal. But so my question is, if that's stated correctly, my question is, evaluating the barrier checklist will take place within 2025. Is that Commerce's timeline?
Yeah, so I mean, there were requirements similar to the periodic update needing to be completed by December 31st. And cities, there's certain provisions within some of the House bills that have amended to the Growth Management Act over the last few years that have similar timelines, deadlines for the city now to complete its implementation work. And so for things like transitional emergency and permanent supportive housing, that work, yes, is going to occur in 2025. So the first step was identifying potential barriers. Then the code work is to develop clear and objective development standards that address those potential barriers and those potential concerns, to show that not only do we have the zone capacity, we also have the code language in place that would allow these uses to be built, and that it wouldn't result in any, undue or unnecessary obstacles to their potential development. Again, we're not required to, to guarantee that this type of housing is going to get built. It's going to be difficult just given the cost of land and all of that, but really this process and really what the Growth Management Act is just ensuring Step one, you have the zone capacity. Step two, you have the regulations in place that don't establish undue barriers for their potential development.
So it sounds like there's going to be plenty of opportunity for the public to weigh in on these. Some of the items on the barrier checklist are fairly substantive, but from what I understand, it sounds like there'll be lots of opportunity for the public to voice opinion on it in the
That's
next.
correct.
Yeah.
Good questions this evening. Are there any other questions from some of our commissioners that haven't commented? Yes, Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, quick question, David. When looking at the, I think it's 3-19, page 27. I'm sorry, rather page 30. So more than half of or roughly half of the housing stock, the housing targets through 2044 are 80% or below area AMI. I'm assuming that the majority of that is multifamily housing. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. And so, so basically that was when we had done so we took the buildable lands report and then we did our land capacity analysis to determine, the zone capacity for different types of housing. There are general assumptions and guidance from the Department of Commerce as far as basically 0 to 80% AMI housing. You need the assumption, especially within the Seattle metropolitan area, is that that's solely going to be met through multifamily residential. And so we needed to show that we had adequate zone capacity for that. And that was really the impetus for some of the zoning changes that were proposed and that were ultimately approved. So the area off of 99th Avenue Southeast, the area kind of the western edge of 20th Street Southeast, some of the areas, basically some of the additional analysis we did within our sub areas as far as the residential capacity within within those areas. Basically, we had to show that ultimately that we would have that zone capacity, and that's what necessitated some of the zoning changes. So, yeah, we were in a situation where we had a surplus. I mean, if you look at, for like 100, over 120%, we need to go up to, we needed to add about 1,900 units. But we had more than that zone capacity, so we didn't need to make any changes on that side of things. We really just had to
So
make
is the AMI, because you mentioned the Seattle metropolitan area, is the AMI Lake Stevens, is it Snohomish County, or is it the Seattle metropolitan area that determines that AMI?
for this calculation, it's the larger metropolitan, just kind of the Seattle, Bellevue, Everett. And so, yeah, there are a couple different numbers that are used. And so when you look at it, though, for just the county, Seattle's is higher than ours. Parts of Everett and then parts of Pierce County are lower than ours, but it kind of actually sort of evens out. So it doesn't make a huge difference for Lake Stevens and for Snohomish County. And so, yeah, and then the AMI can vary depending on obviously household side. It goes up and down depending on how many people are in that household. So it largely is kind of dependent on, it's largely based on like a family of 4, but for multifamily residential, the assumption is the household sizes are going to be a little bit smaller. So that's all factored into the growth targets that are allocated to the city. And then we need to basically show that we have the zone capacity to meet that unit count over the next 20 years.
Okay, and the one follow-up question is about the permitting costs, the regulatory cost. I know that can be relatively, in a lot of cases now, it's cost prohibitive for developers to build affordable housing, given particularly for multifamily housing, some of the burden of from a permitting and regulation can make up 25-30% of the hard cost. If there's with the big increases in the cost of labor, cost of construction, is that something that the state has communicate it back to the cities or things that the city might be doing to help curb some of those hard costs to incentivize more affordable housing construction?
Yeah, and so we have items within our housing action plan that was adopted in 2023 that point to both, on the zoning code side of things, but then there are also, programs, state programs, local programs that we can pursue. There are things that we are able to do as far as like multifamily tax exemptions, things along those lines. So there are items that the housing implementation work doesn't necessarily need to be limited to just the code amendment work. It can be programs, it can be funding, it can be different things that the city does. What we're required to do in 2025 is, especially on kind of the step side of things, the kind of transitional emergency and permanent supportive housing. That's really code work. But that doesn't preclude the city if we, this could be general, guidance as the, advisory body to the city council if there are concerns from the planning commission or recommendations. Those are discussions that we can have kind of tangentially to the code work and kind of fold those into your recommendation to city council on the code amendments. Hey, these are some things that we think the city can be doing. Ultimately, that's more of a policy decision that would be up to the city council to potentially approve, whether that's through the annual budget or whether that's through some other mechanism. So there are opportunities to address that. But yeah, kind of long story short, is that we do have an opportunity to look at different ways to try to increase our supply of affordable housing. Because, there's a reason why there's so little built in the region, especially over the last 5 to 10 years as this region has gotten more and more expensive, is if you have an affordable housing provider that's competing with a market rate housing provider, they're not going to do very well in most situations.
Right.
Even with tax credits, even with all sorts of programs that are already available, the state is not in the best financial situation this year. So we'll have to see kind of, some of the
Yeah.
policy priorities that they establish and some of the funding that goes along with that. And so, yeah, it's been a difficult issue. It's going to continue.
And that really gets to the crux of my concern that, there are these targets, even with all of the incentives, it really doesn't pencil out to build, particularly once you get like at and below 65%. It really, unless the state steps in, we have these targets. I just don't see how it's even close to being, to practical.
Yeah, no, it's going to be hard. And that's why why the state really only requires you to show the zone capacity.
Right.
Russ had sent something out, to a few of the planners this evening before the meeting showing that, just to break into the ownership side of housing in the region is that you need a household income of $175,000 per year. And so, yeah, that's got to be pretty daunting. I'm glad I bought my house, 15 years ago. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much, David. I appreciate
Yeah.
you.
Other questions? Good dialogue. Seeing none, I will offer my own. Affordable land is where it all starts, and there isn't any. And we went through a process many years ago, several years ago. It's all a blur to me. Where we had some sort of a tax credit for developers that were willing to do so much. We spoke about it in the somewhat recent meeting, but nobody had taken advantage of that. It's just the land is too expensive here. So with that said, I don't want to rain on anybody's parade. Are there any other final comments from the commissioners at this point? Okay, hearing none, I deferred closing the public comment because I wanted to give people ample time. I also want to make sure that we have had all of our our questions answered because of the uniqueness of this meeting. I have no problem in continuing the public comment if you feel that it's needed, but I will leave that up to the commission. What would you choose to do?
I can speak to that. I wondered if that would be necessary when I first read the packet, but having heard the presentation from Planner Levitan, I think I would lean more towards moving forward with this, just because to me this seems procedural, and the real meaty discussions about the topics in the barrier checklist will take place over the next year with ample opportunity for public comment on that. Unless and I'd love to throw this out to the other commissioners, unless I'm not understanding it, I think this is to get us in compliance with Commerce. But Commerce isn't requiring us to figure out what the community thinks about the substantive issues tonight. So my inclination is to forward a recommendation. So I'll go silent.
Any other comments?
I concur with Commissioner Davis's proposal.
And if I could just note, we did send this out to all the parties of record, so anybody that commented on the comp plan, I had emailed this and emailed the notice of public hearing and the opportunity to provide written comments and the date and the time of the meeting. Obviously, we've gone remote, which isn't ideal, but still did offer that in-person opportunity to join Russ there in the conference room. And so we didn't receive any written comments. I hadn't received any inquiries about was anyone interested in attending the meeting. And so, yeah, just to provide a little bit more context, we did want to make sure that everyone that had been involved in the process, the comp plan update process, that we had contact information for, we did send out this notice of public hearing to.
Excellent. And one more question. We don't have anybody online, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, no one has come.
Okay, so at this point, hearing what we have discussed and a consensus, it appears with the commissioners, do I have a motion to close the public hearing?
I move that we close the public hearing.
Do I
I'll
have a
second
second?
that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, public hearing is closed. Thank you so much. Good discussion. Questions I was going to ask and you all asked them for me. So thank you for doing my work for me. Let's move on to the next item on the agenda, which is planning
Sure.
commission training.
Sure,
Yes.
Hexford, if I could just note, we do need a recommendation to the city council to amend basically ordinance 1188 to reflect the changes that are shown in attachments 1 and 2.
Thank you for that clarification. Do we have that motion?
Yeah, I move that we recommend that the planning commission forward the recommendation to the city council for approval of the changes to the adopted 2024 comprehensive plan.
A second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain? Okay, with that, thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that. We're going off of many different computers and papers this evening. Now we can be trained on how to be planning commissioners. By all means, Senior Planner Levitan, school us.
Thank you, Chair Hexford. So yeah, this is building on some of the discussions that we had back on January 18th, and then in your special meeting, kind of to prepare for your joint meeting with the city council. And then also in that joint meeting which, you know, I thought, and I think the consensus generally was that that was a really good discussion and really identified a number of items that I think will really, you know, this is a very high functioning planning commission already. And then there were some discussions about ways to improve the coordination and communication between the two bodies, being the planning commission and the city council. So I wanted to take before we really get into a lot of the code work that we're going to be doing in 2025, and we will be bringing that at your next few meetings, things like the process code, like the housing implementation, like the critical areas ordinance update. We've had a number of new commissioners over the last couple of years, and just wanted to kind of take that step back, build upon some of the things that we heard, kind of give really a planning commission 101, and then really just, you know, allow for additional feedback from commissioners and additional discussion on ways, you know, just that they would like to move forward with our work program. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just a really quick PowerPoint. Is that showing now?
Yes.
All right. So really just kind of quick meeting agenda, the role of the Planning Commission. We've talked a little bit about legislative versus quasi judicial, some of the items that don't come before the Planning Commission and the whys. You know, all of you are required to do Open Public Meetings Act training. Thank you to Commissioners Matz and Davis for doing that and sending in that documentation. A little bit more on the GMA and planning framework, and then just basically how to improve the planning process, you know, how we can do a better job of scoping, getting early input from both the Planning Commission and City Council, and et cetera. So really, you know, we've talked about this a little bit, but the Planning Commission is established by the Revised Code of Washington, Chapter 3563. Then at the local level is codified in Chapter 2.64 of the Lake Stevens Municipal Code. You are an advisory body, as we've discussed, on land use, comprehensive planning, and zoning matters. You know, a couple of your main topics, you know, that you do on an annual basis every year is recommending the long range work program and ratification of the annual docket. You know, we did not receive any citizen initiated docket requests, so we will be bringing back the docket at your next meeting. That's going to be focused on city initiated projects. Basically, this, just a reminder, the city is able to amend its comprehensive plan once per year, with a few exceptions, such as adopting new sub areas and things like that, sub area plans. And then a lot of what you do is really engaging with the public, providing feedback, holding public hearings, and then making recommendations, obviously, on these type 6 legislative amendments. So just wanted to very kind of clearly identify and differentiate between legislative and quasi judicial. And then, you know, kind of how the Planning Commission is involved. So when you think about legislative, you kind of can think about it is that it's affecting the entire community. And it's really establishing it's involving policy decisions, basically thinking about city priorities, city policies, basically items that we want to make sure that reflect, you know, how Lake Stevens is going to grow, how it's going to do so responsibly, sustainably, all of that. And so it's factoring that. It's basically developing new policy language or implementing new code language that is consistent with city policies and priorities. So these are what are called in Lake Stevens and in other cities type 6 amendments. So they include comp plan amendments, adoption of sub-area plans, concurrent, like major rezones that are associated with the comprehensive plan map amendment, land use code amendments, so changes to Title 14 of the municipal code, and then also development agreements, which we haven't had a whole lot of, but is also covered under this legislative amendment. On the flip side of things, quasi-judicial is kind of site-specific in nature. It's not developing new policy language or establishing policy priorities. It's basically applying existing codes, standards, and regulations. I think as I've previously noted, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, especially within Washington State, there was very much a push toward shifting a lot of this quasi-judicial review from the Planning Commission and the City Council over to what's called the hearing examiner system. So this is a land use attorney or a land use judge that's hired by the city that basically evaluates specific types of development proposals like preliminary plats, variances, conditional use permits, shoreline variances, shoreline conditional use permits. That's on the type 3 side of things. So basically, in those instances, the hearing examiner basically reviews against the applicable criteria and standards and then issues a decision on those types of land use applications. So that's type 3 land use applications like preliminary plats. Type 4 then is things like site-specific or basically minor rezones. So I know there have been some questions from commissioners where they were aware that there had been some rezones that didn't come before them. That's because they were site-specific in nature and because they didn't require any change to the land use, the future land use designation. That remains a type 4 land use application instead of a type 6. So if somebody say wanted to go from R4 to multifamily residential, that could only be done through the annual docket, which would have to come before the planning commission to get a recommendation on that type of rezone, because that has a concurrent land use map amendment. If you already have the land use designation that you need for the rezone, so say you're going from R4 to R6 or R6 to R812, or even from R812 to multifamily residential, if you already have a high density land use designation, then that doesn't represent a legislative amendment. It's considered a site specific or minor rezone. And that's why there are projects that we understand, you become aware of them, you get questions from the community, but those are items that are not within the Planning Commission's purview. So just wanted to clarify on those, kind of the major difference between legislative and quasi judicial. And if there are any questions while I'm doing this, it's pretty quick, and I'm happy to circle back on any of this. But if you have any questions, feel free to stop me before I devolve into full Levitonese, as I think it's been mentioned in the past. So just a little bit of what we talked about. I think Russ introduced a little bit about the Open Public Meetings Act, but just wanted to circle back on that because that is such an important part of the Planning Commission's role and responsibilities, is making sure that you are doing it in a way that is open and transparent and accessible to the public. So the Open Public Meetings Act, or OPMA, has been around for over 50 years. It basically applies to any meeting quorum. So anytime that you have a majority of your public board or commission, so including the Planning Commission, basically you're subject to the Open Public Meetings Act. And so you don't want to be having, email conversations between not that you don't want, you don't just not want to be, you're not allowed to have basically on matters related to Planning Commission business. You can't have 4 people on an email thread discussing what you talked about in the last meeting. That would violate the OPMA. You get into issues such as serial meetings. If Commissioner Huxford talks to Commissioner Jennifer Davis, who then talks to Commissioner Connor Davis, who then talks to Commissioner Dorr, that can potentially become a serial meeting where you have more than a quorum. So at least 4 out of the 7 members are weighing in, even if they're not having that conversation together. So just making sure that we avoid those situations and stay compliant with the OPMA. It also, includes language about required noticing, establishing and publishing agendas, making sure that we keep adequate track of the occurrences of that meeting and produce minutes. A lot of the technology is changing. A lot of this really, there was some updates to the OPMA back in 2022, following the onset of COVID. Because, when there was a public health emergency, that was a major test of the OPMA, is that, really allowing for that in-person opportunity, while also dealing with the public health emergency. There were some needed amendments. And so there was some language that was rewritten, and that applied to, say, like a meeting like tonight. We didn't have the option just to shift to just the online portion because there wasn't any sort of public health or weather emergency declared at the local, state, or federal level. So that's why Russ is sitting there in the conference room, as we were required by state law to have at least some sort of in-person option. We made sure to post the mill, noting, hey, if you're here for the meeting, go on over to City Hall across the parking lot. And so those are all things that are covered by OPMA. So we like to make sure that we're compliant with that, and that we stay abreast of all of the changes, because this is, with technology, with public health emergencies, this is very much an evolving field. And, that's part of the reason that you're required to do it within 90 days of your appointment to a board or commission, and then you're required to do it every 4 years. They want to make sure that you stay up to date on changes, on new technologies, and how those influence making sure that we make open and transparent meetings available to the public, which is ultimately who we serve. So just a little bit, and we talked a lot about this as part of the comprehensive plan, but obviously the Growth Management Act, or GMA. We'll try to explain our acronyms and spell those out as much as possible. That really at the state level is what establishes the planning framework in the state of Washington. Obviously, it requires local comp plans. They need to be they can be updated once per year through the annual docket. They need to go through what's called a periodic update, basically every 10 years. That number has been creeping up over the last couple decades. It started at 7, 8. It's now up to 10. And then the GMA has kind of become I don't want to use, it kind of, the state legislature sometimes drops in a lot of items into the GMA that it's kind of the default place for a lot of these items, maybe that historically haven't been where some of those items would have logically been placed. But I think they're trying to provide the connection to responsible land use planning and growth management, and making sure, and that's why they typically put it within the Growth Management Act. So that's at the state level. Obviously, some of the major changes were with House Bill 1220. As far as requiring the city to have very specific growth targets at different income levels, that was something that didn't exist before 2021, and that's why this was the first year that the comp plan update was as prescriptive as it was. We had never had to do this. I think there was some comments from the Planning Commission and we'll get into this a little bit more, as far as making it clear at the onset of some of our code work that this is stuff that we're being required to do by the state. Kind of noting, hey, this is an elective update that we think reflects city priorities versus this is something where our hands are tied. We have a little bit of flexibility as far as local regulations, but there's certain items that have come straight out of the GMA that, with the step housing in 2025 being one of them, is that this is something that we're being told that we have to do. So that influences our work program. We obviously need to do that work in 2025. So sometimes it results in more kind of elective code updates being pushed off into future years so that we can meet all of our statutory requirements. So at the regional level, Vision 2050 is kind of the regional plan, basically for future growth within the central Puget Sound area. That's typically adopted about every 10 years. Vision 2050, I can't remember if it was 2021, that it was adopted. That typically is done in advance of the periodic update cycle for the central Puget Sound cities and counties. So basically, we're required to show kind of what largely drives Vision 2050 is the multi-county planning policies, or MPPs, as they're shown there on the screen. Cities required to show how its local goals and policies are consistent with Vision 2050, similar to the way that they're required to show that they're consistent with the Growth Management Act. PSRC has basically a compliance checklist that the city's required to fill out. Basically, if you can't show that you are consistent with those, PSRC that can do things like basically not be eligible for, say, transportation funding or grants, things along those lines. You need to show compliance with Vision 2050. And then just above the local comprehensive plan is what's called the countywide planning policies. So each county has those. So in Snohomish County, those are typically updated a couple years in advance of the due dates of the periodic updates as well. So those were updated back in 2021. That is a collaborative process that city staff, including Lake Stevens staff, participated in. It's kind of organized by the county, but all the individual cities do participate in that. There weren't a ton of huge changes other than to basically comply with some of the changes to GMA and some of the changes within the multi-county planning policy. So it kind of is a domino effect. You get changes at the state level through the GMA, you get changes at the regional level through Vision 2050. The countywide planning policies then need to be updated to show compliance with those. And then when the city updates its plan, ultimately it has to show compliance with all three of those. And so that's really kind of the hierarchy of land use planning as it relates to Lake Stevens. This is just a graphic from a couple years ago, just showing, so there's obviously the comprehensive plan, how the top graphic is kind of how we develop the plan. So you have all of these inputs like community preferences and data, the Growth Management Act, the CPPs, the MPPs, that then, is incorporated into the development of the plan. Then you implement the plan. And so things plans are implemented through ordinances such as the development code. They're implemented through other development regulations, other sections of the municipal code. They're implemented through different city programs. So say if there's a high priority for affordable housing, that can be reflected in housing programs and in funding decisions and budget decisions. They're implemented through capital improvements. If we identify a high priority for pedestrian connectivity, then the capital improvement program, both the 20-year and the 6-year, should reflect that. And then that is implemented through local budget decisions passed by the city council. And then functional plans and a variety of other measures. So the thought is that the comp plan doesn't just get adopted and then not implemented. It's making sure that the comp plan reflects those priorities and then that the policy priorities and the funding and budget decisions from the city council are consistent with that comprehensive plan. So just kind of finishing up on some of the things that we heard at the joint meeting, and I think this is really an opportunity for, a lot of any additional discussion that the Planning Commission would like to have tonight is really some of the stuff that we had heard in those joint meetings. Your meeting on the 8th and then the joint meeting on January 21st was kind of very early in the process, identifying and clearly defining statutory requirements and mandates versus elective updates. Provide that information to not only just the Planning Commission and the City Council, but make that very readily available and make the public aware of that these are things that we are being required to do so that maybe we can avoid some of the uncomfortable situations or some of the, we're always going to get people that weigh in and just all we can do is basically explain why we're doing the work that we're doing and kind of very clearly stating that some of this is statutory in nature. We have a number of different code amendment projects. There were some examples of instances where the Planning Commission did very good work and spent a lot of time, and then there were some changes made. So what are some ways for us to share and solicit input on the scopes of work early in the process and kind of combining that with the third bullet point to really get some of the, allow for early feedback from the Planning Commission and the City Council to convey and to express their perspectives and their priorities so that staff doesn't develop a bunch of code language that doesn't reflect Planning Commission or City Council priorities. And then things get changed right at the last minute, even after a Planning Commission recommendation. So those are some of the things that we heard. And then, even though it's not necessarily within the Planning Commission's purview, there was a good amount of interest on ways that we can provide updates on things like city projects, quasi-judicial decisions, such as, site-specific rezones that are of public interest and that you're going to have people in the community asking you questions about. So making sure that we can get you that information. Obviously we have a fairly limited staff, but we want to make sure that we're responsive to and respectful of the wishes of the Planning Commission, because similar to serving the public, I mean, you utilize staff to get you the information that you need to make informed decisions and to be able to serve in that very important kind of liaison role to the public. That's, I think as a couple of commissioners noted, sometimes people are more comfortable going to a planning commissioner than they are to a city council member. So even if you're not going to formally be involved in a decision, we want to make sure that you have all of the information that you would like to have so that you can have at least informed conversations with the community. And with that, that was kind of the end of this. I'm happy to kind of go in any particular direction. We just wanted to kind of not finalize, but basically kind of before we get into some of the code work that we're going to be doing and developing some of these, scopes of work and sharing them with you, just any additional ideas from the Planning Commission. There's been a major focus on ways, to improve what's already a super high functioning planning commission. I really appreciated my time in working with all of you. And so whatever we can do at a staff level, whatever the city council can be doing to make your jobs easier and to get you the information you need. That was really the intent of this evening's presentation. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or, Russ or I help to facilitate that discussion.
Yeah, and for the sake of Dave's voice, sounds like he needs a break. I'm happy to take any questions for a minute here if there are questions or comments. I will throw out, we did put an attachment in there as well. We had provided a training program for Mirka coming on, and so that's a repeat of the memo that we provided her. Hopefully she's found the links very helpful. And again, we wanted to extend those to the rest of the Planning Commission, again, to really provide that framework that was asked for of what are our decisions, how do we make those, how does that fit into the city, what are the state and local laws that affect us. So we really tried to put together a cheat sheet for you. And, I appreciate the work that Dave put into the presentation as well. I think he really did a great job simplifying some of the terms and really laying out, again, your do's and don'ts. I do have one technical correction with the type 6 land use reviews that the Planning Commission oversees. You actually don't oversee development agreements. That is the one exception. That is a contract between the city council and a developer. So that is purely a contractual city council function. Happy to take those questions, comments.
Anything from the commission?
I'll just quickly state that I have had the chance to go through a lot of the memo that staff has provided, and it's been extremely helpful, especially for me coming up to speed. So very much appreciate it. Hopefully it's a good refresher for the rest of you.
I just wanted to say thanks for the summary of, or more than a summary, you really distilled the conversation that we had with City Council in a way that was super helpful. I walked away from that meeting feeling like it was one of the best we ever had, largely due to the responsiveness of the staff to the feedback at the January 8th meeting, I think, where we were I wasn't there, but the preview of the upcoming joint meeting. So I appreciate that. You taking what happened at our joint meeting and giving us kind of like a path forward with it, that's really helpful.
I'll only add that I was encouraged that City Council was more interested perhaps in what we're doing and our agendas and the discussions that we have. I think that they, if they are not paying attention to some of the dialogue that goes on and some of the discussions that we have, they are missing the tone of what we receive, what we discuss. And I like the idea of recognition that some of the things that the city considers minor, that City Council considers minor, that we are the front line on. And so I appreciate the fact that that was recognized and it continues to this day. So I was encouraged that we are, that door was opened for not necessarily more communication, but more interest. And so thank you very much for putting that together. Anything else? Hearing none, let's move on to commissioner reports. Let's start with our newest commissioner, Commissioner Metz. Anything this evening that you'd like to report on city-related business?
Nothing tonight.
And Commissioner Packard.
Yeah, just one item. It's a bit personal, but for your awareness, I am publicly sharing that I intend to run for city council this fall. Not looking for anybody's vote, although it would be appreciated, but mostly just so that if there are any rumors or anything floating around, you heard it directly from me. I will not intend to bring it up in the future, but wanted to make sure everyone was aware today. That's all I have.
Commissioner Morton.
Nothing. I'm good.
I'm trying to do it by longevity. Commissioner Connor Davis.
Yep, nothing for me.
Not to call you old, but Commissioner Dewar.
Nothing for me, thanks.
And really not trying to call you old, Commissioner Jennifer Davis.
I actually just had one comment, and it has to do with the age-old topic of how to communicate better with the community. And I wanted to give kudos to the city. When I went on to look at our meeting agenda and pull it, there was the pop-up on the city website of the snowplow routes and real-time updates on where, using a map where you could see where the snowplows had been, when they'd been there, what direction they'd been on the streets. And that was, I thought, super helpful for navigating the city today. And I didn't expect to see that. So whoever is responsible for that, I wanted to publicly say thanks. That's a great service to the community to have that so readily available.
Thank you. And I only went through it that way because I am the oldest, so therefore, all of you are younger than me. So I have nothing to report this evening. However, we do have 2 items from our planning director, Wright, who is again alone and lonely in City Hall. I turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Commission. I did the same thing the other day. We had a full staff meeting, and for point of discussion, I started with the newest staff members to the oldest, and one tried to not claim that they had been here longer than me, but you know. And to your comment, Commissioner Jennifer Davis, our Public Works team and our GIS team worked to put that map together. I will say that was not an easy task, and it's probably been worked on since last year. Had to go through some bureaucratic steps that you wouldn't expect, but we have it up, and I'm glad that you're finding value in that. Like to go over our department report with you. So we do the annual reports or the quarterly reports with you throughout the year, where we do a check-in on the Planning Commission work program, other things we're doing, and then the staff puts out an annual report that really summarizes all of the work throughout the year. And you can look at what, you know, this team does outside of just the work that we coordinate with you on. And I'll just run through it quickly because it's in your packet, but it talks about page 1 really just goes through the highlights of what we've done. Obviously, the code amendments, the comp plan, and the items that you're familiar with. We also are always working on process improvement, and we've listed some statistics on the types of process improvements that we have done. Again, that's looking to the community and how do we do work that's more meaningful for the community or for our staff to work smarter. We like to include the statistics of our training opportunities, educational credits that the staff has done. Again, continuing education is in service of the public to make sure that we continue to do our jobs well. Talked about some of the staffing changes. You've all met Dawn, and we're happy to have Dawn here and coordinating the meetings. That's taken a load off of some of the other staff so they can really focus on their day job. We had one team member in our development crew that stepped away, but we had an internal recruitment. So that's good. And then we brought in a new person to replace that. So we also look at opportunities to promote from within when we can and really build our team. And we've been able to do that in a few examples, again, that are listed in the department report. You know, page 2, just go over some permit highlights. One of the things you'll see with land use permits, those are things like your subdivisions. Our numbers are a little bit down, but not considerably down. So they had taken a dive or at least flattened out in 2022. And then I would say the numbers between 2023 and 2024 are actually fairly consistent. And on average, they're higher than the 5-year outlook, if you can believe that. Transversely, we've seen our building permits go down. A couple of reasons for that. One, they are cyclical and they're tied to land use permits. So we will see a boom in building permits. We also adopted the new building code that was much more stringent, which oftentimes you'll see a little bit of panic, people getting in ahead of the change, and then leveling off of permits. And also we've seen a lot of larger permits, and those are sort of talked about in the major permits where we have an assisted living facility, a couple of assisted living facilities and retirement communities. So those are very big permits. And that's also the scale of land that we have left. We just put in a little metric below that that just again explains graphically what I just said, where the land use permits to building permits are kind of cyclical in how they happen. Page 3 of the report just talks about our code enforcement, what that looks like, and our code enforcement numbers between 2023 and 2024 have stayed very similar. As we go into the next page, it really talks about the long-range planning, and you are all very involved in that, but it breaks it down in some statistics that you might not think about. You know, for the comp plan, you had 7 individual workshops, 4 work sessions with the council, 2 open houses, and then all sorts of other outreach that we did. And then just for the benefit of the rest of the community, what those growth targets look like, the code amendments. One thing we included is a look back to the short-term rental code amendment. I know that that gives us all some flashbacks to some pleasant and not pleasant conversations. But what it does show you, though, the final codes that were adopted have been well received by the community. There wasn't the flood of applications that was potentially and feared would occur. And of the new facilities that have licensed, there have been no code enforcement issues. So it shows that the code as adopted is working and has achieved sort of the goals of, you know, the commission and the council. Economic development and outreach, you'll recall, maybe not, earlier in the year, we did outreach on the design for 91st. You know, it was another one of the gateways into our city, one of those other tired shopping centers. The outcome of that were conceptual designs for 91st between Market and 204, and then a different road profile going the other direction on the other side of 204 up to Frontier Park. So those will come back as construction projects in a different year. A few other things we've worked on, beautification. You may or may not know this, the city adopted a flag last year. That was a dream of the mayor, and he brought that to me and said, I want a city flag. And I said, yes, sir. And we got to work with a designer and brought back a flag that was approved by the council, went through a process with our staff, and we were able to bring that to Association of Washington Cities this year. Lots and lots of external collaboration, other things you may not know, but different team members participate on lots of regional groups. Personally, I participate in Snohomish County tomorrow in a couple of capacities in the Planning Advisory Committee. And then in that group, I serve as chair, which means I also attend executive and steering committee meetings. We're members of the Alliance for Affordable Housing. We serve on the Puget Sound Regional Committee Board for Cities and Towns. We have working groups with our building officials. They've formed a cohort of different cities trying to ensure that they're interpreting and implementing building codes the same in neighboring jurisdictions. We have the same customers, so regionally we want to, you know, again, move forward with a common voice. Lots of other examples, and then training. Our code enforcement officer has also started a group with his peers from other cities. Again, the idea is learning from each other and making sure we're applying our rules in a similar manner as we can with our neighbors. And our building crew won an award, specifically that working group, for working together to implement new handouts and communication materials that went along with this year's building a code. So across these different jurisdictions, we have the same handouts, the same material, same customers, so we want the same messages. Then we did something new. We did a little look ahead. One of the things you all know, both physically and maybe you don't know, internally the city has been changing. The mayor's had really strong goals for process improvement, lean improvement, and launching into some new protocols. So we've had a lot of change. And as we go into 2025, I think I can just speak for my team. They want to take a bit of a rest. It doesn't mean we're going to rest on our laurels, but we want to really focus on what we're doing. So the process improvements we're going to look at this year is how can we automate some of the things we do, and how can we simplify some of the things that we do, to, again, continue to provide the service to the community, the planning commission, and others. And one of the things that's an initiative of the mayor's is how do we use artificial intelligence in our daily work? And so that's something we're really going to look at using a pretty unscary tool of Microsoft Copilot, and that will just be limited to our internal material that we give it access to. So our Word documents, things like that, our email accounts, to help summarize our emails, to help create meeting minutes, so things like that. So we're just going to see where we can use some of these new pieces of technology to improve some of the more tedious aspects of our job. You all are familiar with the long range work program and what that looks like. And then we have some objectives for training of our staff also. So I just wanted to share our report with you, and happy to take any questions. If Dave or Christy, also on the line, want to add any color commentary, I welcome that as well.
No, I think that's a great summary. Yeah, no, it's a very active and hardworking department. And then I would just note that the other attachment in there, we had noted that, just for the planning commission, that we would include kind of a standing item, and the most logical place is under the director's report. We don't necessarily need a report on that, but just we plan to maintain just a little bit of a look ahead for future meetings. That was something that the planning commission had expressed an interest in. So happy to answer questions about that as well, but that was intended more just to be informational, just to chart out the types of things that you'll be working on over the next couple months.
I appreciate the recap and the dialogue, and I would hope that if we are scheduling meetings that we have well in advance, you have a very good planning commission, but we're all very busy as well. So if we could get any kind of notice as to when meetings are going to be had or not, at least personally, that would be super helpful. Anything else from the commission? Do we then have a meeting scheduled for the 19th?
We definitely do have items that we could bring you on the 19th, so that's a question for, that is the optional meeting. We can adjust the look ahead. We have a pretty ambitious long range work program, but it is something that we understand that we hadn't discussed that in advance of this meeting. So if there's a preference for kind of defaulting to the 2 meetings per month, or if wanting to get guidance from the planning commission before we make any assumptions about having both meetings in a month, happy to have that conversation now. We can, if people are not available for that second meeting, we can factor that in as well. So it's up to the planning commission as well. We have a lot of code work to do that, we can have that introduction at your next meeting, the optional meeting on February 19th, but it's ultimately up to the planning commission as well.
I think in the past, we've been universal, and we'd rather have less meetings but longer if need be, but that we're all willing to meet depending on staff recommendations. So I think that needs to be an internal conversation. Then let us know as soon as possible. If I'm speaking out of line for anybody else, by all means, jump in.
The only thing I'll add is if you think there's a lot of work, I'd rather have 2 meetings a month in February and March than in July and August. So
I would recommend we do hold the meeting on the 19th. Part of that is because that would be your introduction to the comprehensive plan docket, and then you would be holding a public hearing at the next meeting, and you have a couple of code amendments. I know Dave is starting on the process code. And with our streets code update that Christie is working on, we would be ready to share the first piece of that work on concurrency with the planning commission. And like we did with the comp plan, it's going to have several disparate pieces that we'll want to give due attention to on their own, and then bring you back at the public hearing that assembled piece of work.
Then it's decided. Anything else for the greater good?
Yeah, I'll just say that looking at the extended agenda here, on page 71 of the packet, it looks like we're all set for, 2 meetings per month for the foreseeable, for the winter and spring months. And that makes good sense to me, as long as we're planning on, meeting and holding a meeting and not just checking in and then exiting after 10 minutes, which I don't think we've ever done, but just making good use of our time. But it is a meaty a series of agendas coming up, so I think we'll probably need both of them, and I'm happy to attend as many as I can.
Yeah, I think just for project launch on some of these process code items, and then there'll be, some time in between, when you have your next meeting on that topic. But yeah, we don't want to hold meetings just to hold them. But yeah, there is enough code work and enough items on your work program that, yeah, you're, thankfully we have a good commission. So
Again, anything else for the greater good?
Oh, I do. Yes, I do would like to say something. I'd like to note just a long-term staff person's leaving. If you haven't been made aware, our principal planner, Melissa Place, if you've had the pleasure with working with her, her last day is this Friday at the City of Lake Stevens. So if you've worked with her or want to wish her farewell, I would encourage you just to outreach to her. And we've appreciated her professionalism and her service here as a planner, and we're sad to see her go. So if you know her, I just encourage you to reach out to her. That is
Thank you.
it.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
If there's nothing else, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
And a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you so much for being willing to revert back to this format. I think that it was helpful tonight. Director Wright, please drive safely home, and we will see you on the 19th.
Take care.